Welcome, Sarah Badcock, Professor of Modern History at the University of Nottingham. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your research.
Okay, so I'm a specialist particularly in Russian history, and I've been working on a range of periods from late 19th into early 20th century Russia. I'm interested in the experience of ordinary people in a range of different contexts. So I would describe myself primarily as a social historian, but I would also work in cultural and political and spatial histories as well. So I've done a wide range of things.
A particularly seminal piece of work was your 2016 work, Prison Without Walls. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could tell us why that is important and how that changed the way we see Russian history.
Okay, so the book that you're referring to is my 2016 Oxford monograph, which is called A Prison Without Walls, and it's about the experience of Eastern Siberian exile in the last years of Tsarism. And I think that the book is important because it explores lesser understood parts of what it is to be punished. I was particularly interested in exploring the ways in which punishment is understood and experienced by all prisoners and exiles, not just from the perspectives of privileged political elites. The narratives around exile are often framed around very well-known figures. So Lenin spent time in Siberian exile, Trotsky spent time in Siberian exile, and the people who wrote the most voluminous memoirs are those individuals, these very often well-funded, privileged political elites. And so they actually shape the narrative of what it was like to be a Siberian exile. But in fact, that group made up the tiniest minority of those individuals who experienced Siberian exile. The vast majority of Siberian exiles were actually what is described as common criminals. That is, they were convicted through ordinary courts for very, very serious criminal offences, and they were from extremely humble backgrounds, and they were predominantly illiterate, and they had no money. And so their experience of exile is so far removed from the imagining, the construction of Siberian exile, that somebody like Lenin, who spent time writing books and having tea with his wife, and indeed he had a servant in his home in his Siberian exile. So that kind of rarefied experience doesn't really speak to the day-to-day existence. If I were to sort of summarise what's important about what I find, then I say, well, actually, the experience of transience, of movement, of not knowing, of being disempowered, these are the core parts of the punishment narrative. I've been writing a piece about cold as punishment, and thinking about the climate. Is it a torment to be cold? And so I actually explored that a little bit.
That's really, really fascinating. I wonder if you've found any kind of modern resonances with this sort of material. How does it relate to us now?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that the resonances I feel are meaningful in terms of when we look at punished experience in the turn of the 20th century in Imperial Russia and sort of today's experiences. I suppose that for me, I think about refugee experience, and what it means to be dislocated, to be uprooted, and the punishment that is integral to that, even if it is not intended by a state.
Yeah. Really interesting, and I think the importance of kin and family. We don't appreciate that. That prisoners don't have that advantage until we hear about research like that, and it's an important component of what you do. So what are you working on at the moment?
So at the moment I've been working through a series of pieces exploring different aspects of daily life in late imperial rural Russia. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm really interested in the lived experience of ordinary people, and sort of trying to tease out the meaningful threads of life. And so I've looked at leisure, what people do in their free time, I've looked at literacy and how people use the written word, and then I'm currently finishing an article about old age, which is quite depressing. So it's called Waiting to Die, with a question mark. But I'm exploring, and those three areas actually, they're both quite significant in terms of how we understand the field, because when we think about rural Russian spaces, the scholarship that we have is often focused on particular aspects which I would say are prone to being framed as exotic. So the idea that the Russian village is a place which is awash with alcohol, that it is a violent space, that it is somehow a space in need of management, of control, of intervention. And that is quite a dominant narrative at the time from intellectuals and from state actors. And I suppose I'm trying to re-look at those lives and say, well, you know, did people behave in dramatic and alarming ways in their day-to-day? And the answer is that they did not. So if you, my study of leisure is actually quite mundane, in that what people did in their spare time is they went to one another's homes and they chatted. And they usually chatted in single-sex groups if they were older, or they flirted and had liaisons when they were younger, but that they did things which are very relatable. They chatted, they played games, they drank a lot of tea, they smoked cheap cigarettes. But that alcohol and drama and violence, while these are features of a life, they are not the defining features of a life.
I think that's really interesting, and I think we often find, don't we, in the work that I do, I mean, this is social history, isn't it, that the reality is far less glamorous, perhaps, than either the historiography or indeed the public perception of these places are. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that if I go on to think about old age, so the important bit of old age, I would say, which I'm exploring by looking at the experience of elderly people in rural spaces in late imperial Russia, is that, again, if we look at sort of what we know about elderly people in the villages, it's often framed from literary representation. So Tolstoy talks about the powerful, controlled, in charge, patriarchal, elderly man who can still plough the fields, and he still, controls his household. And so there's those literary representations. And then there's also representations which come from the correct understandings of profoundly patriarchal societies, where age and gender define your space within those communities. And so those assumptions lead us to believe that elder men are dominant in the community. But what that does is it misses out what I would describe as the fourth age. So if we think about the third age is the period of your life, say from around 60 to around 75 in modern understandings, where you are older but still powerful, strong, resilient, physically and mentally able. That bit, yes, that period of life is a period when older people are powerful potentially within rural communities. But what we miss and what we've lost in our understanding of old age is the end part of life. And so contemporary scholarship talks about the fourth age, and that's the time of your life when senescence, the process of aging, really kicks in. So you become weaker, you become less able, you become less mobile.
So can you tell us perhaps a bit about either PhDs that you have supervised, or indeed any ideas that you might have for really interesting potential supervisory projects? I
think that I've supervised quite a number of PhD students, and I've supervised a very broad range of topics. And what I found as a supervisor is that the most important thing is to have a student who is utterly committed to and passionate about their project. That's what matters. And so I'm generally quite reluctant to frame ideas for people, because I've got loads of ideas. I have loads of things I'd love to do, but what I really want to do is work with students who have exciting ideas of their own, and I can help them. As a PhD student, it's your life, it's your work, it's your vision, and I am not the expert, you are the expert. And so supporting brilliant students in their direction, I think that for me is how I see PhD supervision.
Moving on a bit, I think the Department of History at Nottingham is well known for its research-led teaching. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how the research we've spoken about today is woven into your undergraduate teaching.
I love my undergraduate teaching here at University of Nottingham. Not least because I'm able to really explore with my students the topics on which I'm an expert and that I love. So the two undergraduate modules that I'm teaching at the moment they're both final year modules, but one of them is about Russia and Revolution, which is the topic of my first book, and the other one is about rural life over a longer time frame. So I'm looking at rural life in Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union. And so the things that I am excited about and the material I study closely, I bring it to the classroom, and I think that it's a really rewarding environment because I'm genuinely enthralled by the material that I currently work on, and I can take it to my students and learn with them as well. So one aspect of, I suppose, that my recent research, which I could mention, which is really informs my teaching actually, is visual material. So I've done a piece of work over the last couple of years about late Imperial Russian painters and artists, and I've looked particularly at the so-called Wanderers School, which was a school of artists who sought to depict everyday Russian life. And I use the paintings and I use the artists. I also use literature and literary resources to help students connect with these spaces that often feel alien and far away, to encourage them to be able to engage meaningfully with those materials.
That's really, really interesting. So, Sarah Badcock, thank you very much indeed.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.